On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to JLF's Brave New World Season 2. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Those of you who missed our earlier session today, Hunted by the Sky, Tanaz Bhathena in conversation with Meenakshi Reddy Madhavan, you can catch this on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF, and on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest. Our next session today is From Page to Stage and Beyond, Karthika Naïr in conversation with Jai Arjun Singh. Jai Arjun Singh and Karthika Naïr discuss journeys from book to performance and celluloid in their favorite adaptations, particularly of epics. They delve into Nair's experience in the shows she scripted for Akram Khan, for Tim Yip, and for Sidi Larbi, and other artists to reflect on the changes involved in bringing a work alive in a totally different medium, from the solitary freedom of the page to the creative hubbub of collaboration, and that too on stage. Karthika Naïr is an Indian-born French author of books including Until the Lions, Echoes from the Mahabharata, and the principal scriptwriter of shows such as choreographer Akram Khan's Desh. The performances she has scripted and co-scripted have been staged at venues across the world, including Avignon, Esplanade, Theatres by the Bay, and the Lincoln Center in New York. Jai Arjun Singh is an independent writer and critic. His books include The World of Rishikesh Mukherjee, which won the Mami Cinema Writing Award, Jani Bhi Do Yaro, Seriously Funny since 1983, and the anthology, The Popcorn Essayists. Please do remember to ask questions and comment by typing it into the comment section below, and our colleagues will pose this of Jai Arjun Singh and Karthika Naïr. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And of course, if we drop off, just hang in there. We'll be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, from page to stage and beyond, Karthika Naïr in conversation with Jai Arjun Singh. Karthika, Jai, welcome, and over to both of you.
Thanks so much, Sanjoy, for that introduction. It's great to be here participating in the online version of a festival I have been attending since 2006, nearly 15 years, hard as it is to believe. Hi, everyone who's watching this, and welcome to this conversation with one of the most brilliant and engaging minds I know. Hi, Karthika. Just to provide some context first, Karthika, you've had a very varied writing career, mainly as a poet, but also as an essayist and a prose writer. Yet your day job for several years has been that of a dance producer and curator. And your own writing, including the children's book, The Honey Hunter, and the Mahabharat book, Until the Lions, has found a life beyond the page in other mediums, on stage, in dance performances, notably in collaborations with the Akram Khan Company. That's primarily what we're going to be discussing now, but we'll also, of course, touch on our favorite adaptations of our favorite epic, the Mahabharata, which is something we have been discussing a great deal in recent weeks. Before that, let's just start in the best possible way with your book, The Honey Hunter, which is an utterly beautiful illustrated work. The lovely drawings in it are by Joël Jolivet, the French artist. And I'm going to hold the book up and just maybe show you a couple of inside pages as well, just so you have a sense of how brilliant it looks. It's a fantastic looking publication, highly recommended. But a little bit about it. It's set in the Sundarbans forest, and it's the story of a little boy named Shonu, who loves honey so much that despite being good at heart and well brought up, he is tempted to wander into the forest and upset its ecological balance by taking honey from beehives before they are ready. And woven into the story is an old tussle between the goddess of the jungle, Bon Bibi, and a demon king in tiger disguise, someone who must not be named, as we keep getting told, though of course he is named eventually. Both of these magical figures, though they are at loggerheads, they ultimately have the forest's best interests at heart. Karthika, this is such a, as you know, I've praised this book to you before. It's such a gentle narrative, full of mystery and awe. but also with a clear-sighted sense of our responsibilities to the environment. And this is also the sort of book that is never not relevant. In the sense that I remember a few years ago when there was a bad oil spill near the Sundarbans, I thought of this book. It was a reminder of how precarious that region is. And then earlier this year, again, during the terrible tragedy of the Amphan cyclone, again, my thoughts turned to the Honey Hunter. I'd like you to tell us something about this book, but perhaps you could also talk a bit about the process that led to its creation. I know that it all began a few years ago when you scripted a work titled Desh for the dancer and choreographer Akram Khan, partly an autofiction about his relationship with his homeland, Bangladesh. A major dance production came out of that, and the Honey Hunter itself happened just a few years later. So, could you tell us a bit about Desh and how different that was from the book that I was holding up just now?
Thank you. Thank you, Jay. That was just wonderful to go back down memory lane into the process of, into remembering how it all began. Actually, you're right. It's had a pretty eventful life, The Honey Hunter. It originally began, like you said, as part of a script, and Desh is a set of intersecting stories. Actually, like life is. It's supposed to mirror a fictional journey that the Akram Khan on stage makes to his parents' homeland, one with which he, as a child and growing up, has had a very conflicted relationship, and it's the child. Because it's never named, the relationship's never named. Anyway, so the whole idea was to have among all these different strands of stories that are going by, one where the niece refuses to learn Bangla and Akram has to tempt her into learning it. And he said, but how do I do that? And we sort of looked at each other and I said, a story. And let's break it in the middle. And that way the child wants to learn enough. So the story becomes kind of the carrot instead of the stick. And it so happened that our acting coaches, because we were trying this out with various actors, all kinds of different scenarios, and the acting coach's daughter came in one day, and we tried out 3 story strands. 2 were actually existing folk tales, Shukho and Dukhu, and another one which I forget. And Akram, in my eyes, made the mistake of asking her, which one do you prefer? And she went for the imaginary narrative where I'd just written the first 2 lines of what was then the script about, the land of 6 seasons and 18 tides and ruled by a bee goddess. And she went for that. And Akram said, okay, so can you write a story? And here I was cursing myself for actually having written something that didn't exist and having to produce a narrative out of that. That's actually how it began. And rehearsals were in London, and I went down to Delhi for a couple of weeks, and I began writing the story. And that's actually how the book came to be, because Anita Roy, formerly co-founder and editor of the imprint Young Zuban, came by, saw the story, and she said, it absolutely has to become a children's book. And I thought she was just being very generous and encouraging. Came back to Paris, we started rehearsals. And the thing you need to know is that I didn't need to end the story for Desh because we chop it in the middle. There's this portion that you're going to hear, that, it's full of suspense. And that's when the child wants to learn what's happening next. And obviously she will not be told because she needs to learn Bangla. But right. Anita wrote to me and she asked for an ending because she was really determined about the book. I hadn't taken her very seriously. She wanted a story. So then I sat down and wrote an entire story. And then it was a long and ultimately extremely happy, adventure of finding the right illustrator, which we did, Joël Jolivet, whose illustrations you showed, which are absolutely magical, all thanks to the French Book Office, which put me in touch with her. So yeah, and then the book took off on its own journey, parallel to that of Desh. And the funny thing was, 4 years later, we made a children's version of Desh called Choto Desh, which is scripted slightly differently in that we've taken out the more, shall we say, overtly, violent things about Desh, but not about Desh, but about the narratives, about the intersecting narratives like the war. And so it ends, again, the Honey Hunter got picked up because the ending of Choto Desh is from the Honey Hunter. So there's reconciliation for the child.
Right. It's wonderful to hear all this. I must again vouch for the fact that Anita wasn't just being generous when she suggested this, because this is one of the finest children's books that we've had in the last few years, at the level of both text and drawings and the way in which they work together. But really, to get the clearest sense of Desh, the performance, perhaps you could show us part of that performance, and also if you want to just provide it in context with a reading or something from Desh or the Honey Hunter, and help us then best appreciate the way in which the two mediums work together. If you can just do that.
Absolutely. Thank you. The thing I should preface is scripting for dance is very different from writing a play, for instance, because not everything gets spoken. You know, what you're doing is you're providing the ossature, you're providing the skeletal system, and there's muscle and blood and skin, which will come in various media. So when you watch this, you're going to see that there's this specific segment is not spoken at all. And we'd known that from the beginning. And Akram's brilliant idea was to have it in Abhinaya and animation. So even before I wrote, anything more than those first 3 lines. So because he told me that, I knew it needed to be very visual, because it was like a verbal storyboard for the animator who'd never been to the Sundarban and who needed to bring that to life.
Right.
So what I'll do is just read that segment, and you need to imagine this as coming between a lot of other things. Desh is, funnily enough, a solo, but it's populated by a lot of voices. So there's only Akram on stage, but you have animation. You have an entire world coming in animation, and you have voices intersecting all through, the different sketches that are happening. But this particular sketch is the Honey Hunter. So I'll just read a bit. Until one morning, when the hunger for honey had spread from his stomach to his chest, his throat, his legs, his head, and his heart, crawling all over his insides like 1,000 red ants, he could bear it no more. He ran down to the river and hid in the boat of a woodcutter under the floorboards. He lay there quietly, waiting for the woodcutter to cast off. And soon he fell asleep, his hunger drowned by the rocking of the boat. When he woke, the sky was green. Not blue, but green and brown, a sky of leaves and branches with a moving, shifting land below. He saw colors flashing, changing, disappearing. Mud skippers and fishing cats and hermit crabs. Not one staying still long enough for him to be sure he had seen them. And beneath it all, beneath the chatter of cormorants, egrets, and woodpeckers, alongside the rustle of the terrapin and the pythons and the heavy tread of the water buffalo, he heard the music of the bees, the hum of gazillions of bees hard at work. He followed his ears and, with his hand on his amulet, tiptoed through the woods, taking great care not to step on dry branches or anything that looked like a sleeping crocodile. Louder and louder grew the hum until it sounded like a symphony orchestra, complete with woodwind and brass and string sections. Shonu stepped into the kingdom of honeycombs. Black and gold clouds shaped like mountains, castles, crowns, roses, towers. Upside down, sideways, and downside up, hanging from branches, rising from hillocks, growing into hollows. Each buzzing with a gazillion bees, building and making and gathering, all far too busy to notice this hungry little boy with eyes growing wider and shinier till they were miniature suns, and a mouth that had dropped to his knees. Shonu forgot all his father's warnings, his mother's stories. I think I'll move to the visuals now.
That's well, but that's so evocative just at the level of the prose, the descriptive prose, and then of course you have Joel's drawings coming in, and with Desh you have a completely different medium, which I think you'll be showing us now.
Yes. Shall I?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi.
That was so lovely, and I'm sure, like me, anyone else who watched that would be wishing that you could have shown the whole thing rather than just 5 6 minutes. I mean, I wish we had the time for that. But really, the use of animation and set design is of course wonderful. Tim Yip was involved with this, and one thing I wanted.
Sorry,
Sorry,
just
yeah.
interrupting you to say that Tim Yip was indeed the set and costume designer. That beautiful animation you saw is East Culture. It's a design studio which does amazing work.
Right. And yeah, and it just the movement from this performance to what became the Honey Hunter just seems so fluid. They seem very much one of a piece. But of course they aren't exactly the same thing. And in fact, in the video we saw just now, we didn't see the bit where a war tank appears, and there are these references to the Bangladesh war and so on, to cultural memory. What were some of the things that you left out when you did the Honey Hunter, and things that you put in? So, for instance, the Honey Hunter, I know, is much more explicitly an environmental story, a story about ecological preservation and the need for it. What, as a writer for you, what were the main challenges moving from one work to the other, in deciding what to leave out and what to put in?
Well, The Honey Hunter was a narrative entire to itself. So there's nothing that's been left out in the sense that it's sort of a story within a story, very, very explicitly in Desh. So The Honey Hunter has its own entire narrative, and it's more a case of what was taken into Desh. So as you saw the landscape, but for instance, not we do mention the fact that it's a year when there's been famine because of a cyclone, but that very explicit passage in The Honey Hunter where the parents tell Shonu and the narrator tells the child as to why there is increased uncertainty and fragility of the universe, I mean of that ecosystem in particular, that's not something that you go into in Desh. On the other hand, there are narratives which don't come in because either I wrote them individually, or Akram and I wrote them together, or Polar Bear and I wrote the connective tissue, which is the back and forth between the Akram character and a schoolgirl in Chittagong who's also a Microsoft troubleshooter in the universe of the piece. Those are entirely distinct narratives, so they didn't need to come into The Honey Hunter anyway. It was a fable within the story, And what you thought is the Independence War. There's a bit about the Liberation War, but it's mainly the Dhaka siege of 1987 when there was a popular civil uprising against military rule. That's the one that we've referenced.
Right. Now, of course, the Honey Hunter is centered on a local mythology around a particular region. The Bangladesh, the Sundarbans, and so on. But I was thinking, in the book that you did subsequently, Until the Lions, Echoes from the Mahabharata, you've turned your gaze to a much wider mythology, one of the great achievements of world literature, the Mahabharata. And we've had many conversations about the epic in the last few years. It's a collection of your book is a collection of poems told in the voices of the most marginalized characters in the Mahabharata. And one of the most notable of those poems and those voices is that of Amba, who is a character who has a relatively short role to play in the early segments of the Mahabharata, but in another sense, her shadow is over the whole work because she's bound with Bhishma, who is one of the major characters in the epic, and she feels wronged by him, and she comes back. She is reborn to take revenge on him. And I know, and we've talked about this before also, that you've been less than happy with some of the representations of Amba and the reborn Amba Shikhandi in popular culture, in both the literature and in some of the cinematic tellings of the Mahabharata. So, for instance, there's a 1965 film version of the Mahabharata in which Shikhandi is presented in the most tediously and offensively stereotypical way possible, as an effeminate woman who's just cowering on the battlefield in front of Bhishma, causing him to put his weapons down. And then, of course, even something like Peter Brook's Mahabharat, which is a much more celebrated work, even that doesn't quite do justice to the Amba Shikhandi story in the end. I know you had an issue with some of this, so perhaps you can just put this in context. Tell us a bit about your version of Amba in Until the Lions, and the reason I'm focusing on her is also because, again, this did turn into a very fine dance performance that involves Amba, Shikhandi, and Bhishma in this eternal sort of dance of retribution and recrimination. If you can just tell us something about the poem and your perspective on the character.
Yeah, what's vindicated my interest, not that it needed any vindication, but what's vindicated my interest in Amba Shikhandi is also that the most adaptations of the book that have happened, whether it's Akram's, whether it's the opera adaptation, which would have premiered in March at the Opéra National d'Urgence, if it hadn't been for the pandemic, they all do center around the Amba Shikhandi arc. Even ones done by high school children or at the Conservatory of Glasgow, they've picked up this. So I feel like Amba, is belatedly coming back to the fore. You're right. I mean, there are many representations of Amba in adaptations which have been less than satisfactory, and sometimes very intriguing. As we both know, the Peter Brook Mahabharata gives some magnificent lines to Amba, but it also takes away agency from Amba and reduces her quest for justice to a kind of what was it that Krishna Chaitanya called her? Flighty woman's,
He used many adjectives. He used fickle and flighty and tempestuous damsel, and many such things. Yes.
It sort of lends credence to that, because one of the things which I've never been able to understand among dramaturgical choices is that Brook and Carrière call it a tournament, Ambika, Ambalika's Swayamvara, whereas what's quite compelling is the notion which the canonical telling gives you, that this is an act of great violation, because these women were given the agency to choose their grooms. It was not a tournament. It was not a feat of strength which was supposed to decide their fates or choose their. It was not strength or valor which was supposed to predicate who they wed. But Brook and Carrière kind of overlook that, and they say that Bhishma went to a tournament and won these women. So in the first place, that removes the reason itself for Amba's sense of violation. And at the end, as we know, after giving her these magnificent appearances and some of the greatest lines I find in that adaptation, like when she comes across the Pandavas and they look completely befuddled as to how she could still be so youthful, and she says, "Hate keeps me young."
Yeah.
Corinne Chabert is unforgettable, and so are the lines. But in the last sequence, in the last scene featuring Shikhandi, who's now Shikhandi, Amba now Shikhandi, he forgets the reason for his desire to take vengeance, and he puts down his arms. He says, "Why this hate?" Which runs counter to everything. I mean, it's antithetical to the entire 2 lifetime quest that Amba leads. I wanted to correct that in the book. So in the book, what happens is, as you know, it is a duel that's empty of Krishna and Arjuna, and it's Shikhandi coming, face to face with Bhishma. And like she says, neither shall win. I will slay you, but first you shall watch me die. So there is also a knowledge of the impending death of Shikhandi. And when Akram and I spoke, this was of all the poems, I don't think he even read the other ones. This was the one that he wanted to stage, because he also remembered Peter Brook's Mahabharata. He'd been a part of it. He played Ekalavya in the filmed version, and the one, the one that was subsequently made into the 5.5-hour, 6-hour film.
Yeah.
He had fond memories, but also the same, shall we say, interrogations about why it took that turn, and so this was wish fulfillment of our own kind.
We are almost on the verge of having to take questions from the audience. So do you want to read a bit from your poem, or just show a very quick bit of the
Yeah.
video?
Yeah, I think I'll just show, because it's yes.
Yeah, so I think that it comes across very powerfully there, even just in that clip, which is obviously just a small segment of the whole. But I think what you said earlier about wanting to keep the whole encounter purely between Amba and Shikhandi, her reincarnation, and Bhishma. without having Krishna coming in and playing puppet master, or just intervening in whatever way. You just have this in the midst of this great war that's being fought. You have this extremely intimate moment involving two people who had this confrontation generations earlier, and now it's time for some sort of retribution. I think we really need to, much as I would love to keep watching some of these videos and keep talking about the Mahabharata and adaptations, I think we need to take a few of the questions that have come in. So I think I'll just start here. Ria asks, this is a question for you. As you picked the Mahabharata as a point of reference for your work, what was the process of research for this? The Mahabharata spans so many generations and decades. How did you bring it together for your work? And of course, if I can just quickly add to that, the Mahabharata has also been told and retold so many times, countless times. It's not like there's just one Mahabharata. There are so many of them. So yeah.
But that's what's fascinating, isn't it? I think of I think of Until the Lines as sort of very much in the lineage of Mahabharatas that are conversing with older Mahabharatas and with parallel Mahabharatas. One of the things that I find very interesting is how there are so many tellings which in many ways ricochet from each other. And as far as the research, apart from everything I'd grown up watching, and a lot of that was performance, because as you know, something that nurtures me a great deal is the multiple performance traditions there are and their own variations, because so many of the performance tellings are predicated in regional ethos, and that brings in its own flavor, its own set of heroes and villains and turnings to the story that the canonical tellings may not contain. One of which is for instance Shashireka Parinayam, that we are dealing with so much in the Mahabharata courses with Mayabazar, and similarly with the Perata Vemba and the entire arc dedicated to Aravan, who is extremely marginal in say Vyasa's Mahabharata. So the research was it was not just limited to reading whatever I could get my hands on, and sometimes they were in languages that I didn't have access to, so I asked people to read it out to me, or the copies were not available, as was the case with some of the Malayalam tellings. So my parents would read it to me through Skype, because I couldn't get them in Paris. It was also watching everything possible. And one of the best pieces of advice I got was not really to do with the Mahabharata, was from a friend who said, read everything, watch everything that is to do with conflict, because this is really about conflict. This is about man's primal capacity for violence as well. And so I watched everything from, Coriolanus to multiple tellings and stagings of Iliad and Odyssey and Antigone, from everyone from Sophocles to Anu, who, by the way, has done a brilliant Antigone, to with no shame at all, Avengers. Anything that had to do with war was fodder for me, or conflict, or the human capacity for resistance, violence, reaction, you name it.
And of course, conflict is also defined as inner conflict, right? Conflict within oneself, not just externally with someone else or on a battlefield. We have another question from Paridhi, who asks, is there a character from Until the Lions that you felt the most attached to, or was there a character that you felt was most relatable?
Well, all these are characters that I chose because they spoke to me, because I felt it was a bit like a possession. They were characters that at some point sort of invaded all my waking hours, and that's why they are the ones that I've written about and not someone else. I haven't written about Draupadi, for instance, also because I didn't see what I could bring fresh to the narrative. Instead, I have Draupadi's mother, the unnamed character in most of the tellings, who views what it is like to have children who have been created with the purpose of destruction, for instance. So every single one of the characters had something, for obvious reasons or not obvious reasons, that I felt I could channel or occupy. My own favorite is probably Shunaga, the dog.
Shunaka the dog, excellent. And I'm very glad about that. Which is also, of course, the only character that you just created.
Yeah.
The others are all, even though they are characters who are not actually named in the Mahabharata, you have taken them from the basic text, or at least what's implied in the text.
One of the tellings from,
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
one or the other of the many tellings there are, they're all ones who exist, even if they're unnamed. But Shunaka, I really invented. I imagined her to be, related to the various dogs in the Mahabharata, whether the one that follows Yudhishthira, whether the one whose mouth is, closed by Ekalavya's arrow.
Eklavya's arrows. Yeah, yeah. Would you say she's also the most relatable of the characters? Because that was the second part of the question.
Well,
but
for
but,
me,
but
she,
I think the answer to relatable would just sort of would depend on who the reader is, right? Because that's part of the point of a work like this, that you have so many characters, so many marginalized characters with different perspectives, and it becomes a kaleidoscope of sorts.
but I thought the question was relatable to me, in which case, I think she has the same kind of cynical outlook. I don't know if it's cynical, but she certainly has a sort of wry uh, fatality about things.
Okay, there's one question for me, which I'm not sure I'm exactly qualified to answer, but I'll just address it very quickly in the context of the Mahabharata. Do you believe there's a major difference in writing forms and styles between print, television, and performance-based writing? I haven't written for television. I haven't really written for performance-based, pieces or anything like that. But based on on my experience as a critic and an observer, and also based on what we've discussed about the Mahabharata, for instance, one of the things that we talked about was that the television Mahabharats, even when they are funny, tedious, tacky in some ways, a lot of the Indian TV Mahabharats just tend to be a bit difficult to watch at times because they are full of these prolonged, endlessly stretched out sequences, reaction shots, etc. But the one thing they do have going for them, if the writer does his or her job with basic sincerity or seriousness, is that when you have such a large canvas, you have a TV show which has potentially 200 episodes, 300 episodes to explore the Mahabharata. You end up by default humanizing all the characters or finding nuances in them, even when you don't actually set out to do, even when you're setting out to have Duryodhan typecast as a villain and the Pandavas typecast as heroes. Just in the process of showing Duryodhan in mundane, everyday situations, you end up humanizing him and perhaps even making him relatable in some way. So that's one thought that came to me in this context. But coming back to questions for you,
And if I can
yeah,
chip in into that, I would add and say that for me, performance and poetry have the sort of the necessity for compactness. So in performance, you're not going to be as expository as you would say in a novel. I mean, you have various ways of making that happen in a longer narrative, and that's why, for instance, when Jean-Claude Carrière gives us a Duryodhan whom we instantly understand because he says, I want to be discontented.
right.
I don't need anything more. That gives me this Duryodhan. So for
Yeah.
me, there's that thing about whether it's stage or performance that you need to get the essence of the greatest bit of writing that happens is one that gives you the essence, whether it's the conflict, whether it's the incomprehensibility of the
You
person.
get the soul of the character right there with something like that. Yeah. Okay, just one question for you. Your work, Aruna asks, your work involves you in working with international dancers, transforming words into movements and visual effects into prose and poetry. What is it that you keep in your mind when you have to move between these different performing spaces? And I think another question for you is linked to that. How has your writing style evolved and developed between writing books, poetry, screenplays? Is there a conscious effort in differing the styles?
Um, Let me put it this way. When I write, content will define form, and when I that's for what's my world, poetry, the page, the what I said about the freedom of solitude. It's entirely content that defines form, even in terms of the form I use for poetry or for prose or whatever. When I'm writing for stage, the thing I'm most conscious of is the need for the writing to be as invisible as possible to the viewer except when necessary. So in dance, I follow the thumb rule that the writing should only be present as words when nothing else can sort of transmute it effectively. So the bits that I read to you about the honey hunter were written with the knowledge that they should not appear. They should not. Most people don't even know it's scripted, you know.
Right.
So, but it had to be as visual, as tangible as possible for an entire set of collaborators, whether the composer, in this case, most prominently the animator, or Akram, for a movement language to be sort of invested and inhabited.
Sadly, I'm told that we're out of time now for the session, including the questions. So, it's been wonderful whatever we have managed to talk about. Thanks so much, Karthika, for those insights and for your for letting us into the many worlds you inhabit as a writer. That's it. Back to you, Sanjoy. Are you here?
Thank you, Jay. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Karthika. Thank you, Jay, for that fascinating session on translations and adaptations. I wish we're going to hear much more of this. We're sorry we couldn't take all your questions. There was just too many streaming, and I know everybody is really interested. This whole issue of how do you translate, how do you adapt, how do you move from fiction to film, and so many other forms. Please do remember to log on back on Friday, the 2nd of October, to watch another set of great sessions on JLF's Brave New World. The first one is Into the Heart of the Himalayas, Jono Linen in conversation with Prajwal Parajuli. A solo trek over 2,700 kilometers through the Himalayas, undertaken after the death of his brother, led author Jono Linen through a spiritual journey across the mountainous terrains of Pakistan, Ladakh, and India. And this will be at 7 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 2:30 p.m. British Standard Time, and 9:30 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Following this, we have Chosen Spirits, Samit Basu, in conversation with Deepanjana Pal. In a fraught world of climate change, 24-hour surveillance, and the degeneration of the public and private self, author and screenwriter Samit Basu's most recent book, Chosen Spirits, paints a disturbing picture of present realities. Shortlisted for the 2020 JCB Prize for Literature, the book presents a futuristic Delhi lost to the control of mass surveillance and the catastrophe impact of technology. This is at 8:30 p.m. IST, 4 p.m. British Standard Time, and 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And a reminder to block 4th of October for I Believe Art Matters. Even as the world is impacted, the economies sort of contract and shut down, artists and artisans across the world have been hugely devastated and decimated, especially here in India. We have an advocacy and a fundraiser that's been put together, hosted by none other than actor Shabana Azmi and Manoj Bajpayee, with dance, music, theater, and comedy, including the likes of A.R. Rahman, Kailash Kher, Shekhar Avjiani, Amit Trivedi, Indian Ocean, Aditi Mangaldas, Papa CJ, Malavika Sarukai, and over 450 other artists. Please remember, block your date on the 4th of October, 5 p.m. Indian Standard Time, and remember to donate. Stay safe, mask up.